The translator changed only 6 words. 6 words spoken so casually that nobody at the table reacted. The lawyers continued reviewing documents. The investors remained focused on projected earnings. The executives exchanged confident smiles, believing months of negotiations were finally coming to an end. Even Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire CEO sitting at the center of the room, appeared completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Yet only a few feet away stood a waitress holding a bottle of wine, and the moment she heard those 6 words, her heart nearly stopped. Because unlike everyone else in the room, Claire Parker understood exactly what had just been said. And more importantly, she understood what had not been said. The translator had altered the message. Not enough to attract attention. Not enough to create confusion. Just enough to change the meaning. Just enough to redirect responsibility. Just enough to turn a billion-dollar agreement into a financial disaster waiting to happen. In that instant, Claire realized something that would transform an ordinary evening into a story nobody involved would ever forget. The translator wasn't making a mistake. He was lying. On a cool evening in Manhattan, the Belmore Room looked exactly as one would expect from a restaurant catering to the wealthiest people in America. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across polished tables. Expensive artwork decorated the walls. The dining room remained quiet despite being full because the people who came here did not need to raise their voices to command attention. Decisions worth millions of dollars were often made between courses. Careers were launched over dinner. Partnerships were formed over wine. Tonight, however, the stakes were even higher. Behind closed doors inside a private dining suite, representatives from one of America's fastest-growing technology companies sat across from executives representing a powerful German manufacturing corporation. Months of negotiations had led to this moment. Analysts had examined the numbers. Attorneys had reviewed every page. Consultants had prepared reports thick enough to fill entire shelves. The acquisition being discussed carried a value exceeding $1 billion. If completed successfully, it would reshape both companies and place Ethan Caldwell in an even more powerful position within the business world. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned. At least, that was what everyone believed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What nobody realized was that the most important person in the room wasn't seated at the negotiation table. She wasn't a lawyer, an investor, or a corporate executive. She wasn't appearing in business magazines or speaking at conferences. She was serving wine. Claire Parker had spent years perfecting the art of becoming invisible. Customers remembered the food, the atmosphere, and the conversations they had with their guests. Very few remembered the person who refilled their glass. Claire preferred it that way. Invisible people heard things. They noticed details others ignored. They learned secrets hidden in plain sight. But there was another reason Claire stood apart from the restaurant's other employees. Years before she ever carried a serving tray through the Belmore Room, she had lived in Germany. She had studied the language extensively. She spoke it fluently. Yet almost nobody in her current life knew that. It simply wasn't information that ever seemed important. Until tonight. Until the moment she heard Victor Hartman translate a statement that did not match the words spoken by the German executive sitting across from Ethan Caldwell. At first, Claire questioned herself. Perhaps she had misheard. Perhaps there had been context she missed while serving another table. Yet moments later, Victor did it again. And then again. Each alteration seemed small. A revised percentage. A softened liability. A modified obligation. Tiny changes that individually appeared harmless, but collectively created a very different agreement than the one being discussed in German. Claire continued moving through the room as though nothing was wrong, but internally her thoughts raced. Why would a professional translator risk changing the meaning of a billion-dollar negotiation? Translators existed for one purpose: accuracy. Their reputation depended on precision. One serious mistake could end a career. Yet Victor Hartman wasn't behaving like someone worried about making a mistake. He seemed completely comfortable, completely confident, almost as though he expected nobody would ever question his translations. Claire found herself studying him more carefully. He appeared calm, experienced, polished, the kind of professional executives trusted immediately. His voice never shook. His expressions remained controlled. Every movement suggested confidence. Yet the more she listened, the more certain she became that the discrepancies were intentional. The realization unsettled her because intentional deception raised questions far more troubling than accidental error. If Victor was lying, then someone stood to gain from those lies. Deals of this size didn't collapse because of a few misplaced words. They collapsed because someone carefully positioned those words exactly where they wanted them. And if Claire was right, Ethan Caldwell was preparing to sign documents based on information that wasn't entirely true. The consequences could be catastrophic. As the discussion continued, Claire noticed another detail that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Whenever one particular topic emerged, Victor seemed especially careful with his wording. Liability protections, future obligations, financial guarantees. The German executives spoke clearly, yet the English versions reaching Ethan's side of the table consistently favored one party over the other. It was subtle enough that nobody without knowledge of both languages would detect it. But once Claire recognized the pattern, she could no longer ignore it. She began wondering how long this had been happening. Had Victor manipulated other negotiations in the past? Was tonight an isolated incident, or was it part of something much larger? More importantly, what should she do? Interrupting a billion-dollar meeting based on her observations could cost her job. Remaining silent could cost someone else hundreds of millions of dollars. Between those two possibilities stood a decision that would soon place her directly in the path of powerful people with enormous interests at stake. And before the evening ended, Claire Parker would discover that Victor Hartman was hiding far more than a few altered translations. Most of the people who entered the Billionaire room never remembered Claire Parker's face. They remembered the wine selection. They remembered the conversation. They remembered the executives seated around the table. But they rarely remembered the woman who quietly moved between them carrying trays and refilling glasses. Claire had learned long ago that people often overlooked those they considered ordinary. In a place like this, attention naturally drifted toward power, toward wealth, toward the individuals signing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A waitress simply became part of the background, and for the last 7 years, Claire had allowed herself to remain there. She arrived on time. She worked hard. She avoided unnecessary conversations. She kept her head down and did her job. To management, she was reliable. To customers, she was nearly invisible. Yet what nobody in that restaurant knew was that Claire Parker had once imagined a very different future for herself. Years before she stepped into the Billionaire room for her first shift, she had lived an entirely different life on another continent. One that had taken her thousands of miles from New York and placed her in the middle of a world she never expected to leave behind. Long before she became a waitress, Claire had been a student with ambitious plans and remarkable talent. Languages came naturally to her. While other students struggled to memorize vocabulary and grammar, Claire absorbed new languages almost effortlessly. By the time she graduated from college, she was fluent in German and conversational in several other European languages. Professors described her as one of the most gifted language students they had encountered in years. Opportunities followed quickly. International internships, study programs abroad, professional connections. Within a few years, Claire found herself living in Germany, working in environments where bilingual professionals were highly valued. For a time, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as she had hoped. She traveled frequently. She built friendships across Europe. She developed a reputation for precision and professionalism. Colleagues trusted her. Employers respected her. Looking back, it seemed almost impossible that someone with so much promise would eventually find herself carrying wine glasses through a Manhattan restaurant. Yet life has a way of changing direction without warning. A single decision, a single conversation, a single event. Sometimes that is all it takes. And somewhere in Claire's past existed a moment she rarely allowed herself to remember. A moment connected to Germany. A moment connected to trust. A moment that would become increasingly important as this story unfolded. Back inside the private dining room, Ethan Caldwell remained focused on the negotiations. The Billionaire CEO had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Every person seated around the table had been thoroughly vetted. Attorneys had reviewed credentials. Consultants had recommended experts. Mark Hartman, the German interpreter facilitating communication between both sides, possessed an impressive professional record. His resume reflected years of experience handling high-stakes corporate negotiations. He appeared exactly like the kind of specialist companies hired when billions of dollars were on the line. Calm, experienced, intelligent, the sort of person whose presence reassured everyone in the room. Yet as Claire continued moving between tables, she became increasingly convinced that the confidence surrounding Mark Hartman was misplaced. She listened carefully whenever German was spoken. Every translated sentence received her full attention. Again and again, she detected subtle differences, tiny adjustments that changed meaning without attracting suspicion. A softened condition here, a revised obligation there, small enough to avoid scrutiny, significant enough to alter outcomes. Each new discrepancy intensified the same troubling question. Why would an experienced interpreter risk everything by changing critical information during a billion-dollar acquisition? The answer remained hidden, for now, but Claire could feel herself moving closer to something she didn't fully understand. She began studying Mark Hartman whenever she had the opportunity. He rarely appeared nervous. He never stumbled over words. His confidence remained unwavering. In fact, what disturbed Claire most was how comfortable he seemed while doing it. People making innocent mistakes often display uncertainty. They correct themselves. They hesitate. Mark did neither. Every altered translation emerged smoothly and confidently, as though he had rehearsed the changes beforehand. That possibility unsettled Claire more than she wanted to admit. Because if the changes were planned, then tonight's deception had begun long before anyone entered the Belmore room. It meant preparation, intent, purpose, and if someone had prepared this carefully, then there was likely far more at stake than a few altered sentences. Claire glanced toward Ethan Caldwell again. He sat reviewing financial projections, completely unaware that the information reaching him might already be compromised. The realization left her with a growing sense of urgency. Yet she still lacked one thing she desperately needed before taking action: proof. Then the moment arrived that erased any remaining doubt. A senior German executive leaned forward and spoke directly to Mark Hartman. The sentence was clear, precise. There was no ambiguity whatsoever. Claire happened to be standing nearby, pouring wine into a crystal glass as the executive finished speaking. Mark nodded in acknowledgement. For a brief second, Claire expected him to repeat the statement accurately. Instead, she heard something that made her freeze. The executive had just instructed him in German to translate a clause exactly as it appeared in the contract. The wording could not have been more direct. Translate exactly as written. Nothing more. Nothing less. Mark Hartman nodded calmly. Then, without hesitation, he translated something different. Not dramatically different. Not enough to trigger immediate alarm among those who couldn't understand German, but different enough that Claire instantly recognized what had happened. He had ignored direct instruction. He had deliberately changed the meaning anyway. And in that moment, every explanation she had been searching for disappeared. This was no misunderstanding. No accident. No professional oversight. Mark Hartman knew exactly what he was doing. The terrifying question now was why. And as Claire Parker stood silently holding a bottle of wine, she had no way of knowing that the answer would lead directly into a secret that stretched back years before this meeting ever began. The moment Claire Parker realized that Mark Hartman had deliberately ignored a direct instruction from the German executive, the entire meeting began to look different. Details that had seemed ordinary only minutes earlier suddenly demanded closer attention. Conversations carried new meaning. Expressions exchanged across the table appeared more calculated. Every translated sentence became another piece of a puzzle Claire was only beginning to understand. Yet before she could determine why Mark Hartman was changing critical information, she first needed to understand exactly what was at stake. And the answer was staggering. This was not a routine corporate negotiation. It was one of the largest acquisitions attempted in the technology sector that year. Ethan Caldwell's company, Caldwell Dynamics, had spent nearly 18 months pursuing an ambitious expansion strategy. His vision was simple in theory, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. He wanted to merge American software innovation with German manufacturing expertise. If successful, the acquisition would create a global powerhouse capable of dominating multiple industries simultaneously. Investors had praised the strategy. Financial media had celebrated it. Analysts projected billions in future growth. The deal carried a valuation exceeding $1 billion, making it one of the most closely watched corporate transactions of the year. For Ethan Caldwell, This acquisition represented far more than another business victory. It represented validation. Unlike many executives born into wealth or privilege, Ethan had built his fortune from the ground up. Years earlier, he had started with little more than an idea, relentless determination, and a willingness to accept risks others avoided. Over time, he transformed a small technology startup into a company worth billions. Business publications admired his discipline. Investors trusted his judgment. Employees viewed him as proof that success remained possible through persistence and intelligence. By the time he entered the Belmore room that evening, Ethan Caldwell had earned a reputation as a leader who rarely made costly mistakes. Yet, like every successful executive, he depended on specialists. Lawyers interpreted contracts. Analysts reviewed financial data. Advisors evaluated risks. And when negotiations involved multiple languages, experts like Mark Hartman became essential. Ethan trusted Mark completely because there seemed to be no reason not to. Mark's credentials were impressive. His professional history appeared spotless. He had participated in high-level international negotiations for years. To everyone involved, he was simply another trusted professional helping facilitate a complex transaction. The possibility that he might be manipulating the deal never crossed Ethan's mind. As discussions continued, Claire Parker paid closer attention than ever before. The more she listened, the more troubling the situation became. Mark Hartman wasn't making dramatic changes that would immediately attract suspicion. Instead, he specialized in something far more dangerous. Precision. A percentage would change slightly. A liability clause would become less restrictive. A financial obligation would shift from one party to another. A deadline would gain flexibility. None of these alterations sounded alarming when heard individually. In fact, most seemed insignificant. The attorneys remained focused on broader contractual language. Investors concentrated on projected profits. Executives discussed long-term growth opportunities. Nobody appeared concerned by adjustments that sounded minor on the surface. Yet Claire understood something they did not. Billion-dollar contracts are often won or lost through details hidden deep within legal language. A single sentence can determine who assumes risk. A single phrase can transfer responsibility. A single number can change future liabilities by hundreds of millions of dollars. Mark Hartman wasn't altering random pieces of information. He was targeting specific sections capable of reshaping the agreement without attracting immediate attention. Every modification favored one side. Every modification increased risk for Ethan Caldwell's company. The longer Claire listened, the more she realized the deception followed a pattern. Patterns mattered. Patterns revealed intention. And intention suggested planning. This wasn't someone improvising under pressure. This was someone executing a strategy. Her concern intensified as she observed reactions around the table. The German executives seemed unusually confident. Several exchanged subtle glances whenever important clauses were discussed. Meanwhile, Ethan Caldwell appeared increasingly satisfied with the progress of negotiations. From his perspective, the evening was unfolding perfectly. The acquisition seemed positioned to deliver extraordinary value to his company. The investors appeared pleased. The lawyers were preparing final revisions. Everything pointed toward a successful signing. Yet Claire could see something none of them could. Every altered translation quietly pushed the deal further away from what Ethan believed he was agreeing to. The consequences would not become obvious tonight. They might not become obvious for months. But eventually, someone would discover the discrepancies. And when that happened, the financial consequences could be devastating. Then Claire noticed something that made her forget every previous concern. At first, it seemed insignificant. A simple movement. A quick glance downward. The kind of thing nobody else would have paid attention to. But Claire had spent the entire evening watching Mark Hartman carefully, and one small detail suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Whenever German executives referenced specific sections of the contract, Mark would briefly look down before translating. That alone wasn't unusual. Translators often review documents during negotiations. Yet something about the timing felt wrong. Claire began paying closer attention. Again, Mark looked down. Again, he translated information that didn't match the original statement. Then it happened once more. This time Claire shifted position slight, giving herself a clearer view of the materials in front of him. What she saw sent a chill through her. Mark Hartman wasn't reading from the same document everyone else was discussing. The realization was so unexpected that Claire initially questioned her own eyes. She looked again. The formatting was different. The page layout didn't match the copies sitting in front of the attorneys. Several sections appeared rearranged. Most alarming of all, Mark seemed to consult his version before making each critical alteration. The implications were enormous. If he possessed a different document, then the deception had been prepared in advance. Someone had created that version. Someone had provided it to him. Someone expected him to use it. Suddenly, this no longer looked like one dishonest translator manipulating a conversation. It looked like part of a larger operation involving planning, coordination, and intent. Claire Parker's pulse quickened as a terrifying possibility entered her mind. Mark Hartman wasn't acting alone. And if that was true, then the most dangerous person in the room might not be the translator at all. For the first time since the meeting began, Claire Parker stopped focusing on what Mark Hartman was saying and started focusing on why he was saying it. The difference mattered. Until now, she had been trying to determine whether the discrepancies were mistakes or deliberate alterations. That question had already been answered. Mark Hartman was changing critical information intentionally. The discovery of the second document had removed any remaining doubt. Now a more troubling question demanded her attention. Who had prepared it? Because documents like that did not appear by accident. They were created, reviewed, delivered. Someone wanted Mark Hartman to use that version. Someone expected him to guide the conversation in a specific direction. Claire continued moving through the dining room, maintaining the calm professionalism that had made her nearly invisible for years. She smiled when customers thanked her. She refilled glasses. She cleared plates. To everyone watching, she looked like a waitress completing another shift. Inside, however, her thoughts were moving rapidly. Every altered translation, every modified number, every softened liability clause, every subtle change pointed towards something she had seen before, something she had spent years trying to forget. The memory arrived suddenly, not because Claire wanted to remember it, but because the similarities had become impossible to ignore. Years earlier, long before she worked at the Billionaire room, before New York, before the quiet life she had carefully built for herself, her family had owned a manufacturing company in Ohio. It wasn't a giant corporation. It wasn't worth billions. Yet it represented everything her father had spent his life building. For nearly 3 decades, he had transformed a small operation into a respected business employing hundreds of workers. Families depended on those jobs. Communities depended on that company. Claire remembered walking through the factory as a teenager and seeing employees greet her father by name. She remembered the pride he felt discussing future expansion plans. She remembered hearing conversations about international partnerships that could secure the company's future for generations. At the time, everything seemed promising. Then a foreign acquisition entered the picture. Investors arrived. Negotiations began. Lawyers became involved. Translators facilitated discussions between both sides. Everyone celebrated what appeared to be a historic opportunity. The agreement promised growth, new markets, greater stability, a brighter future. At least that was what everyone believed. The collapse happened slowly at first. Then all at once. Months after the acquisition closed, unexpected obligations emerged from the agreement. Financial responsibilities appeared where none had been anticipated. Critical liabilities shifted onto her father's company. Clauses that seemed harmless during negotiations suddenly carried devastating consequences. Lawsuits followed. Debt accumulated. Investors withdrew. Within a few short years, the company that had taken decades to build was gone. Employees lost jobs. Families faced uncertainty. Claire watched her father struggle to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. For years, he blamed himself. He reviewed documents, repeatedly searching for mistakes. He questioned every decision he had made. Yet no matter how many times he revisited the deal, one detail continued to trouble him: the translations. Several participants later claimed important discussions had not been translated accurately during negotiations. Unfortunately, by the time concerns surfaced, the damage had already been done. Nobody could prove what had happened. No one could establish whether the discrepancies were accidental or intentional. The acquisition collapsed into legal disputes and financial ruin. Eventually, the story faded from public attention, but it never disappeared from Claire's memory. Standing inside the Billionaire room years later, Claire felt the same uneasy certainty she had felt while watching her father's company fall apart. The similarities were too precise to ignore. Once again, there was a foreign acquisition. Once again, there were complex negotiations involving multiple languages. Once again, a trusted translator occupied a position nobody questioned. And once again, subtle changes were appearing in places capable of reshaping the entire agreement. The realization unsettled her because it suggested that tonight's events were not random. If she was seeing the same pattern, then perhaps someone else had used it before. Perhaps many times before. Claire began paying even closer attention to every interaction involving Mark Hartman. She noticed how carefully he managed conversations. She noticed how quickly he redirected discussions whenever certain topics emerged. Most importantly, she noticed how confident he remained despite the enormous risks involved. People usually became nervous when they lied. Mark seemed completely at ease, almost as though he had done this before. As the evening progressed, Claire searched for an opportunity to learn more. She knew she couldn't confront him. Not yet. She needed information. Proof. Something concrete. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly when one of the attorneys requested a brief recess to review updated documents. The room relaxed slightly as conversations broke into smaller groups. Executives stepped away from the table. Investors checked messages. Staff moved quietly through the room preparing for the next stage of the meeting. During the brief pause, Mark Hartman gathered several papers and placed them into a leather portfolio resting beside his chair. For only a few seconds, the portfolio remained partially open. It wasn't much, just enough for Claire to catch a glimpse of a business card tucked inside one of the compartments. She almost kept walking. Then she saw the name. Mark Hartman. The sight should not have surprised her. After all, she already knew who he was. Yet something about the name struck her immediately. A memory. A distant fragment buried beneath years of frustration and loss. She stopped for the briefest moment as her mind raced backward through time. Newspaper articles. Legal documents. Conversations overheard late at night between worried adults. Her father's voice discussing the acquisition that destroyed everything. Then suddenly the memory surfaced. A name. Not the full name. Just the surname. Hartman. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Years earlier, during one of the final investigations into her father's failed acquisition, that name had appeared repeatedly in discussions surrounding disputed translations. At the time, she had paid little attention. She was younger, focused on different concerns. Yet now, standing only a few feet away from Mark Hartman, the memory returned with startling clarity. The surname had been uncommon enough to stand out, uncommon enough to remember, uncommon enough to make her wonder whether the connection was possible. Claire stared at the portfolio for another second before forcing herself to move. Her pulse quickened. Her hands suddenly felt cold. Because if the memory was correct, then tonight's events were far bigger than a dishonest translator altering a billion-dollar deal. If the connection was real, then Mark Hartman wasn't just someone she happened to recognize. He might be connected to the very acquisition that destroyed her father's company years ago. And if that was true, then Claire Parker had just uncovered the first piece of a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The moment Claire Parker recognized the surname Hartman, the evening stopped being a story about a suspicious translator and became something far more personal. For years, she had convinced herself that the collapse of her father's company belonged in the past. The lawsuits had ended. The factory had closed. The employees had moved on. The financial damage had long since become permanent. Yet standing inside the Belmore room, watching Mark Hartman manipulate a billion-dollar negotiation with the same calm confidence he had displayed all evening, Claire found herself asking a question she had never seriously considered before. What if her father's company had not simply been the victim of a bad deal? What if someone had engineered the outcome from the beginning? The thought refused to leave her mind. More importantly, the similarities between then and now were becoming impossible to ignore. Once again, there was an international acquisition. Once again, there were complex negotiations involving multiple languages. Once again, there was a translator occupying a position of trust. And once again, critical information appeared to be changing before it reached the people making the final decisions. Claire could no longer dismiss the connection as coincidence. As the negotiations continued, she began quietly gathering information whenever opportunities appeared. During breaks between service assignments, she paid attention to documents left momentarily unattended. She memorized company names. She noted dates mentioned during conversations. She listened carefully whenever executives referenced previous transactions. Every detail mattered. Every detail might help explain why Mark Hartman seemed so comfortable manipulating information in a room filled with attorneys and corporate leaders. What Claire discovered over the next several hours would transform suspicion into something much more alarming. Piece by piece, a pattern began to emerge. The names were different. The industries varied. The countries involved changed from case to case. Yet certain details repeated themselves with unsettling consistency. Failed mergers, unexpected liabilities, financial losses that appeared years after agreements were signed, investors who somehow emerged wealthier despite corporate collapses, executives who resigned suddenly and vanished from public attention. And hidden among those stories was a familiar name, Hartman. At first, the connection appeared weak. One article mentioned a translator present during negotiations that later became the subject of legal disputes. Another report referenced communication discrepancies discovered after a merger unraveled. A third described concerns raised by shareholders who believed important details had not been accurately conveyed during acquisition talks. None of these stories proved wrongdoing. None resulted in criminal charges. Most were eventually forgotten. Yet Claire noticed something that nobody else seemed to have connected. The same surname appeared again and again. Hartman, sometimes directly involved, sometimes listed among consultants, sometimes mentioned only briefly, but always somewhere nearby when negotiations ended badly. The more Claire thought about it, the more disturbing the pattern became. Because these weren't isolated incidents. They stretched across years, across industries, across continents. Each case looked different on the surface, yet beneath the details, the structure remained remarkably similar. One company lost control of critical assets after contractual language was interpreted differently by each side. Another found itself responsible for liabilities executives claimed they never agreed to assume. In a third case, shareholders accused management of approving terms that ultimately benefited outside investors while destroying long-term company value. The public explanations varied. Economic downturns, market pressures, strategic mistakes, poor leadership. Yet a closer look revealed a recurring outcome. The companies suffered. Investors positioned correctly beforehand profited. Executives responsible for approving the deals often disappeared from public view. And somehow, Mark Hartman's name or connections appeared near enough of these transactions to raise serious questions. Questions nobody seemed interested in asking. Claire's thoughts returned repeatedly to Ethan Caldwell. At that very moment, the billionaire CEO remained focused on closing what he believed would become the defining acquisition of his career. He still had no idea that the information reaching him might already be compromised. The same confidence that had helped him build a billion-dollar empire now left him vulnerable. He trusted experts because successful leaders often have no choice but to trust experts. He trusted attorneys to understand legal risks. He trusted analysts to evaluate financial projections. And he trusted Mark Hartman to accurately communicate what was being said across the table. The tragedy, Claire realized, was that Ethan Caldwell wasn't making irrational decisions. He was making decisions based on information he believed was accurate. That was what made the situation so dangerous. A lie delivered through a trusted source rarely looks like a lie. It looks like truth. But one question continued bothering Claire more than any other. Could one translator really orchestrate something this sophisticated alone? The deeper she examined the pattern, the less likely that explanation seemed. Mark Hartman could influence conversations. He could alter translations. He could shape perceptions. But he couldn't create entire corporate strategies. He couldn't position investors. He couldn't prepare alternate documents without assistance. Someone else had to be involved. Perhaps several people. Someone with access to contracts before negotiations began. Someone capable of benefiting from the outcomes. Someone powerful enough to remain invisible while others absorbed the consequences. The realization changed everything. Claire was no longer investigating a dishonest translator. She might be staring at the edge of something much larger. A network. A system. A method repeated so carefully over the years that nobody had ever connected the pieces. Then something happened that made her blood run cold. Throughout the evening, Claire had believed she was observing Mark Hartman without attracting attention. She had spent years perfecting the ability to disappear into the background. Customers overlooked her. Executives ignored her. Investors barely noticed her existence. She assumed Mark viewed her the same way. A waitress. Nothing more. Yet as the meeting entered another critical discussion regarding liability protections, Claire noticed Mark pause in the middle of a translation. It lasted less than a second, barely long enough for anyone else to notice. His eyes shifted away from the executives and settled directly on her. For a brief moment, neither looked away. Then Mark continued translating as though nothing had happened. Claire immediately felt a knot form in her stomach. The look hadn't been random. It hadn't been casual. It carried recognition, a realization. And suddenly Claire understood why. Every time Mark altered a sentence, she had reacted slightly. Sometimes a raised eyebrow. Sometimes a brief hesitation. Sometimes an expression she couldn't fully hide. Small responses invisible to most people, but not to someone trained to study communication for a living. Mark Hartman had finally connected the pieces. He knew she understood German. The realization struck Claire with terrifying force. Until now, she had been the only person in the room aware that a deception was taking place. Now Mark Hartman knew there was a witness. And for the first time all evening, the translator looked genuinely concerned. The game had changed. Because from this moment forward, Claire Parker was no longer simply observing the conspiracy. She had become part of it. The moment Mark Hartman realized that Claire Parker understood German, the balance of power inside the Belmore room shifted. Until then, Claire had enjoyed one critical advantage. She could see the deception while remaining invisible to the people responsible for it. That advantage vanished the instant their eyes met across the room. Mark's expression changed only slightly, but for someone who had spent the evening studying him, the difference was impossible to miss. For the first time since the negotiations began, he looked uncertain. Not frightened, not panicked, simply aware. A professional who had suddenly discovered that someone else understood the game being played. Claire continued working as though nothing had happened, but internally, she knew the situation had become far more dangerous. Mark Hartman no longer viewed her as a waitress. He viewed her as a threat, and intelligent people rarely ignore threats. What followed felt less like a business negotiation and more like a silent psychological contest. Neither Claire nor Mark spoke directly to each other. Neither acknowledged what they knew. Yet every interaction carried new meaning. Every glance became a message. Every reaction became information. Mark began changing his behavior almost immediately. His translations became more cautious in some places and more aggressive in others. Several times he paused before delivering altered statements, as though measuring Claire's response before deciding how far he could push the deception. Claire noticed him watching her repeatedly. Whenever German executives discussed important financial obligations, his eyes briefly shifted toward her. Whenever liability clauses emerged, he monitored her reactions carefully. He wasn't simply translating anymore. He was testing her, trying to determine how much she knew, trying to determine whether she possessed evidence, trying to determine whether she intended to act. Claire responded by giving him nothing. Years of customer service had taught her how to control her expressions. She smiled when appropriate. She moved calmly through the room. She maintained the appearance of a waitress focused entirely on her responsibilities. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her mind continued assembling pieces of a puzzle that was growing larger by the minute. The more she observed Mark Hartman, the more convinced she became that he was operating under instructions. Certain topics triggered immediate changes in his behavior. Certain clauses received special attention. Certain sections of the contract seemed unusually important to him. Most revealing of all, his modifications consistently benefited the same interests. The pattern was too precise to be random, too consistent to be personal preference. Mark Hartman wasn't inventing changes because he wanted to. He was implementing changes because someone wanted him to. Then came the first real test. A German executive raised concerns regarding long-term liability protections. It was exactly the type of discussion Claire had learned to watch carefully. The executive's statement was direct, clear, unambiguous. Yet when Mark translated it, he altered several critical details. This time, however, he immediately looked toward Claire afterward. It lasted only a second, but the message was unmistakable. He wanted to see whether she reacted, whether she challenged him, whether she revealed herself. Claire kept her expression perfectly neutral. She continued pouring wine into a nearby glass without hesitation. Mark returned his attention to the table, but Claire understood what had just happened. He was probing her defenses, looking for weaknesses, looking for certainty. As the evening continued, another troubling realization emerged. Mark Hartman wasn't acting like someone worried about being caught. He was acting like someone confident he had protection. That distinction mattered. Confidence of that kind usually came from knowing powerful people were invested in your success. Claire found herself paying closer attention to everyone seated at the negotiation table. The executives, the attorneys, the investors. Somewhere among them was a person with both motive and opportunity. Someone who benefited from the altered translations. Someone who had likely arranged for Mark Hartman to participate in the deal. The question was who? The answer revealed itself gradually. Not through a dramatic confession, not through a careless mistake, but through a series of small observations that became impossible to ignore once placed together. Claire noticed one executive communicating with Mark differently than everyone else. Brief glances, subtle acknowledgments, tiny moments of familiarity hidden beneath professional behavior. At first they seemed insignificant, yet the more she watched, the more frequently they appeared. The executive rarely spoke directly to Mark. He didn't need to. Their communication seemed almost rehearsed, as though both understood things nobody else in the room understood. Claire paid attention whenever that executive became involved in discussions concerning liability clauses and financial obligations. Almost every major alteration occurred shortly afterward. The connection became harder to dismiss. Then she remembered something else. Earlier in the evening, while clearing documents from a side table, she had overheard part of a private conversation. At the time it seemed unimportant. Now it returned with startling clarity. The executive had mentioned preparations being completed before negotiations even began. He had referred to someone as our insurance policy. Claire hadn't understood the comment then. She understood it now. Mark Hartman wasn't the architect. He was the insurance policy. The realization sent a chill through her. Because the executive wasn't some outside consultant or distant investor. He was one of Ethan Caldwell's most trusted advisors. A man who had worked alongside the Billionaire CEO for years. A man with direct access to confidential negotiations. A man capable of influencing decisions long before contracts reached the final stage. The person benefiting from the deception wasn't sitting across from Ethan Caldwell. He was sitting beside him. Claire's pulse quickened as the pieces finally aligned. The alternate document. The carefully altered translations. The recurring patterns found in previous mergers. The confidence Mark displayed despite enormous risks. None of it made sense until now. Someone close to Ethan Caldwell had created the opportunity. Someone close to Ethan Caldwell had positioned Mark Hartman inside the negotiations. Someone close to Ethan Caldwell stood to profit if the acquisition collapsed years later under hidden obligations that nobody discovered until it was too late. For a brief moment, Claire forgot she was standing in a crowded room. Because she knew who it was. She finally knew who had hired Mark Hartman. And she finally understood why this billion-dollar acquisition looked so disturbingly similar to the deal that destroyed her father's company years ago. All she needed to do now was warn Ethan Caldwell. But fate had other plans. Just as Claire began searching for an opportunity to reach him privately, one of the attorneys announced that the final revisions were complete. Conversations stopped. Documents were organized. Chairs shifted around the table. The atmosphere changed immediately. Months of negotiations had reached their final stage. The signing was about to begin. Claire felt a surge of urgency. The window was closing. If Ethan Caldwell signed the agreement before hearing the truth, everything might be lost. She took a step toward the private table, then another. But before she could reach him, the meeting adjourned briefly to prepare for the final signing ceremony. Executives stood. Investors moved into separate discussions. Attorneys gathered contracts. And Ethan Caldwell disappeared through a side door, surrounded by advisors, including the very person Claire now believed had orchestrated the entire scheme. The truth was finally within reach. But so was the signature that could make it irrelevant. The moment Ethan Caldwell disappeared through the side door with his advisors, Claire Parker felt something she had been fighting all evening. Panic. For hours she had carefully observed, analyzed, and connected pieces of a puzzle that nobody else in the room could see. She had discovered altered translations. She had uncovered a pattern stretching across multiple failed mergers. She had identified a connection between Mark Hartman and the deal that destroyed her father's company years earlier. She had even determined that someone close to Ethan Caldwell appeared to be directing the deception from inside the negotiations themselves. Yet despite everything she had learned, one devastating problem remained. She still had no proof. Suspicion was not evidence. Patterns were not evidence. Memories were not evidence. If she approached Ethan Caldwell now, she would sound like a waitress making extraordinary accusations against respected executives, attorneys, and professional consultants. The billionaire CEO had spent years building a company worth billions of dollars. Why would he trust her over people he had known for years? The question haunted her as she watched attorneys organize final documents around the conference table. The signing stage had begun. Time was running out. The atmosphere inside the Billionaire room changed dramatically. Earlier in the evening, conversations had unfolded slowly as executives debated terms and attorneys reviewed details. Now everything moved faster. The final contract had been prepared. Signatures were expected soon. Investors appeared energized. Staff moved efficiently between tables. Expensive pens were placed beside carefully arranged documents. Assistants coordinated schedules for post-signing announcements. Every minute brought Ethan Caldwell closer to completing the acquisition. Claire understood what that meant. The farther the process advanced, the harder it would become to stop. Once signatures appeared on paper, reversing the agreement could become nearly impossible. She needed to reach Ethan before that happened. But reaching a billionaire surrounded by advisors, attorneys, and security was easier imagined than accomplished. Claire's first attempt failed immediately. She spotted Ethan Caldwell speaking privately with two attorneys near a hallway leading toward the executive lounge. Trying to remain professional, she approached carefully, intending to request a brief conversation. Before she could get within several feet of him, a member of the security team stepped directly into her path. The interaction remained polite but firm. Ethan Caldwell was preparing for a major corporate announcement. Unscheduled interruptions were not permitted. Claire tried to explain that she needed only a moment. The security officer shook his head. Whatever she wanted could wait. She watched helplessly as Ethan disappeared into another room without ever realizing she had tried to reach him. The rejection stung more than she expected, not because security had done anything wrong, but because it reminded her of a painful reality. In that environment, she was still just a waitress. Nobody expected her to possess information capable of affecting a billion-dollar acquisition. Refusing to quit, Claire looked for another opportunity. This time she approached one of the attorneys. The response proved no better. The attorney listened politely for a few seconds before dismissing her concerns. International negotiations often involved minor translation differences, he explained. Legal teams reviewed final documents carefully. There was nothing to worry about. Claire wanted to argue. She wanted to explain that the differences weren't minor. She wanted to tell him about the alternate document Mark Hartman had been using throughout the evening. But without proof, every explanation sounded weaker than the last. By the end of the conversation, she could see the attorney no longer viewed her concerns as credible. He thanked her for bringing the matter to his attention and walked away. Claire stood alone, watching another opportunity disappear. Meanwhile, Mark Hartman appeared increasingly confident. The translator continued monitoring her movements throughout the room. Several times their eyes met briefly. Each encounter seemed deliberate, almost as though Mark knew exactly how powerless her position had become. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that he understood something she didn't. He wasn't acting like a man worried about exposure. He wasn't acting like someone desperate to avoid discovery. Instead, he behaved like a man convinced he would win. That confidence unsettled her more than any altered translation. Confidence usually comes from certainty, and certainty suggested protection. Somewhere inside the Billionaire room, someone powerful still believed the plan remained intact. As the minutes passed, Claire began questioning herself. What if she was wrong? What if years of anger over her father's failed company had influenced her judgment? What if she had connected unrelated events simply because she wanted answers? The possibility exhausted her. For the first time all evening, doubt began replacing determination. She found herself standing alone near a service station, watching preparations for the signing ceremony continue without her. Around her, executives laughed. Investors discussed future opportunities. Staff prepared champagne. Everything suggested success. Everything suggested celebration. Claire suddenly felt very small in comparison. A waitress carrying suspicions against people whose influence stretched across continents. Perhaps the attorney had been right. Perhaps she should walk away. Then she remembered her father. Not the businessman who lost everything. Not the man burdened by debt and legal disputes. She remembered the father who once walked proudly through his factory, greeting employees by name. She remembered the optimism he carried before the acquisition collapsed. She remembered the confusion in his eyes when hidden obligations emerged from documents he believed he understood. Most of all, she remembered something he said years after the company disappeared. The hardest part wasn't losing the business. It was knowing someone knew what was happening and never spoke up. The memory struck Claire with unexpected force. Someone knew. Someone had watched. Someone had stayed silent. And because of that silence, hundreds of families paid the price. Claire straightened immediately. The doubt vanished. She wasn't fighting for revenge. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting to prevent history from repeating itself. The realization sharpened her focus. If proof existed, she simply hadn't found it yet. Moments later, an unexpected opportunity appeared. One of the German executives requested copies of several revised documents. In the confusion that followed, folders were temporarily moved between rooms while assistants organized paperwork. Claire noticed a familiar leather portfolio resting unattended near a side conference table. Mark Hartman's portfolio. For a brief second, nobody was watching. Claire moved carefully. Her pulse quickened. Inside the partially open portfolio sat the same alternate document she had glimpsed earlier. This time she saw far more than formatting differences. Entire sections contained handwritten annotations. Clauses had been highlighted. Translation instructions appeared in the margins. Most shocking of all was a series of notes comparing the official contract language against altered wording Mark was expected to deliver verbally during negotiations. Claire stared in disbelief. There it was. The proof. Not suspicion. Not theory. Not memory. Evidence. Direct evidence. Written instructions showing exactly how critical portions of the agreement had been manipulated. Then she noticed something even more devastating. At the bottom of several pages appeared initials. The initials belonged to the executive she had already suspected. The trusted advisor sitting beside Ethan Caldwell. The man with direct access to every stage of the acquisition. The man Claire believed had hired Mark Hartman. Suddenly, the entire scheme became clear. And for the first time all evening, Claire Parker possessed something nobody could dismiss. Proof that the translator had been lying from the very beginning. Proof that the alternate document was real. Proof that someone close to Ethan Caldwell had helped create it. The only challenge remaining was getting that evidence into the billionaire CEO's hands before he signed away more than $1 billion. And at that exact moment, the attorneys announced that the final signing ceremony would begin in less than 10 minutes. Less than 10 minutes remained before Ethan Caldwell would sign the most important agreement of his career. Around the Belmore room, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The negotiations were over. The debates had ended. The lawyers had completed their revisions. The investors were smiling. Champagne had been prepared. Assistants moved efficiently between tables carrying finalized contracts. Every sign pointed toward celebration. Yet Claire Parker knew something nobody else in the room understood. Hidden among those carefully prepared documents was a deception capable of costing Ethan Caldwell hundreds of millions of dollars. The same deception she had first detected when Mark Hartman changed 6 seemingly insignificant words. 6 words nobody noticed. 6 words that had exposed an entire scheme operating beneath the surface of a billion-dollar acquisition. Now Claire possessed the evidence she had been searching for all night. The alternate document. The handwritten instructions. The altered language. The initials linking the scheme to someone inside Ethan Caldwell's inner circle. For the first time since the evening began, she had proof. But proof means nothing if it arrives too late. As executives returned to their seats, Claire realized the window was closing faster than ever. Ethan Caldwell sat at the center of the table reviewing the final contract. To his right sat trusted advisors. To his left sat attorneys preparing signature pages. Across from him, representatives of the German corporation appeared relaxed and confident. Among them sat Mark Hartman. The translator looked composed, but Claire noticed subtle changes in his behavior. His confidence remained, yet there was tension beneath it now. He had spent the last hour monitoring her movements. He knew she understood German. He knew she suspected something. What he did not know was that she had obtained evidence. For the first time all evening, Claire held an advantage he couldn't anticipate. Yet using it would require doing something she had spent years avoiding, drawing attention to herself. The signing ceremony began. Documents were distributed. Pages turned. Pens were placed beside signature lines. One attorney started reviewing the final sequence of events. Claire felt her heart pounding. If she waited any longer, the acquisition would become official. If she acted now, she risked humiliation, termination, and possibly legal consequences. The room remained focused on Ethan Caldwell. Nobody noticed Claire stepping forward. Nobody noticed until she spoke. Then everything stopped. Conversations ended instantly. Pens froze above paper. Executives turned. Investors looked up. For a brief moment, nobody seemed capable of understanding what was happening. A waitress had interrupted a billion-dollar acquisition moments before the final signatures. Silence filled the room. Claire's voice remained steady. She asked Ethan Caldwell one simple question. Had anyone verified that Mark Hartman was translating from the same document everyone else had been reviewing all evening? The reaction was immediate. Confusion spread across the table. Several attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. One executive demanded an explanation. Another instructed security to intervene. Yet Ethan Caldwell raised his hand before anyone could remove her. Something about her confidence caught his attention. Perhaps it was the certainty in her voice. Perhaps it was the timing. Or perhaps successful people learn to recognize when someone truly believes what they're saying. Whatever the reason, Ethan Caldwell allowed her to continue. What happened next changed everything. Claire placed the alternate document onto the table. The room fell silent again. Attorneys immediately leaned forward. Several pages were compared against the official contract. Differences appeared almost instantly. Paragraphs had been modified. Key phrases had been rewritten. Certain liability clauses carried entirely different meanings. For the first time all evening, visible concern appeared on the faces of people who had entered the room expecting celebration. The attorneys requested additional documents. Comparisons continued. One discrepancy became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became dozens. The deeper they looked, the worse the situation became. Every critical area Claire had worried about contained alterations. Financial obligations, liability protections, future responsibilities, risk allocations. The pattern was undeniable. Then came the recordings. Earlier in the evening, portions of the negotiations had been automatically recorded as part of standard corporate documentation procedures. Attorneys quickly accessed several segments involving key discussions. Native German speakers from the German delegation were asked to review the original statements alongside Mark Hartman's translations. The results were devastating. Again and again, the recordings confirmed the same conclusion. The original German statements said one thing. Mark Hartman's translations communicated something different. Not dramatically different. Not enough to attract immediate suspicion. Just enough to reshape the agreement. Just enough to alter outcomes. Just enough to create enormous consequences years later. The room that had once been preparing to celebrate now resembled an investigation. Questions came rapidly. Executives demanded answers. Attorneys challenged explanations. Investors began reviewing documents independently. And at the center of it all sat Mark Hartman. For the first time all evening, he looked uncomfortable. Still, he denied everything. The discrepancies were misunderstandings, he claimed. Translation was complex. Nuance mattered. Context mattered. Language could be interpreted in different ways. For several minutes, he defended himself with remarkable skill. Each accusation received a carefully prepared response. Each inconsistency received an explanation. The strategy almost worked. Almost. Then Mark Hartman made a mistake. A small mistake. The kind of mistake that would have gone unnoticed by nearly everyone in the room. Except Claire Parker. Frustrated by the growing pressure, Mark muttered something quietly in German under his breath. Most people ignored it. Most people couldn't understand it. Claire could. And what he said changed everything. Because he didn't speak like a translator defending his professional judgment. He spoke like a participant protecting a plan. The statement referred to information that should have been unknown to him unless he had been directly involved in preparing the altered documents. The moment the words left his mouth, Claire saw a realization spread across the faces of the German executives. They understood exactly what he had admitted. One of them immediately challenged him. Another demanded clarification. Mark attempted to correct himself. It was too late. The damage was done. The accidental admission connected him directly to the alternate version of the contract. His defense collapsed almost instantly. Yet even as the evidence mounted, another realization emerged. Something still didn't make sense. The scale of the operation exceeded anything one translator could accomplish alone. The alternate documents required access. The financial planning required expertise. The investor positioning required coordination. The repeated pattern across multiple acquisitions required years of preparation. Mark Hartman had clearly participated, but participation was not the same as control. As attorneys continued examining evidence, the truth became impossible to avoid. Mark Hartman wasn't the mastermind. He was an employee, a highly compensated employee, a specialist hired to perform a specific role. The altered translations, the manipulated language, the strategic changes. Someone else had designed the operation. Someone else had financed it. Someone else had positioned Mark Hartman inside negotiations where billions of dollars were at stake. The translator had not been running the scheme. He had been working for someone. And as Ethan Caldwell slowly turned toward the trusted advisors seated closest to him, a far more disturbing question entered the room. If Mark Hartman wasn't the mastermind, then who was? The question lingered over the Belmore room like a storm nobody could escape. If Mark Hartman wasn't the mastermind, then who was? For several seconds, nobody spoke. The recordings had exposed the altered translations. The document comparisons had revealed deliberate manipulation. Mark Hartman's accidental admission in German had destroyed his credibility. Yet despite everything uncovered, the most important piece of the puzzle remained missing. Someone had orchestrated the operation. Someone had positioned Mark inside the negotiations. Someone had ensured the altered language consistently benefited the same interests. And as Ethan Caldwell looked around the room, surrounded by people he had trusted for years, a terrible possibility began taking shape. What if the threat had never come from across the table? What if it had been sitting beside him all along? The attorneys moved quickly. Years of experience had taught them how to follow evidence rather than assumptions. They reviewed the handwritten notes found inside Mark Hartman's alternate document. They compared initials. They examined communication records connected to the acquisition process. One by one, connections emerged. At first they seemed minor. A private meeting omitted from official schedules. Unexplained communications before negotiations began. Financial transactions routed through consulting firms with no obvious connection to the deal. But as more information surfaced, those isolated details began forming a clear picture. Every path led back to the same individual. A senior executive. A trusted advisor. A man who had spent nearly a decade helping Ethan Caldwell build his company into a billion-dollar powerhouse. A man whose opinions influenced major decisions. A man whose loyalty had never been questioned. For years he had occupied a position few people ever achieve. Complete trust. And now that trust was collapsing in front of everyone. The realization hit Ethan Caldwell harder than any financial loss ever could. Money could be recovered. Companies could rebuild. Contracts could be renegotiated. But betrayal from someone considered family was different. The senior executive had attended strategy meetings, shared private conversations, celebrated victories, offered advice during difficult periods. Ethan had trusted him with confidential information worth billions of dollars. Looking back, certain moments suddenly appeared different. Recommendations that once seemed harmless now carried darker implications. Acquisitions that failed unexpectedly. Partnerships that collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Deals that somehow benefited outside investors despite damaging the companies involved. For years, Ethan had blamed market conditions, economic uncertainty, and unfortunate timing. Now another explanation stood before him. Someone had been quietly steering outcomes from behind the scenes. Someone had been creating opportunities for profit while leaving others to absorb the losses. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, the scope of the scheme became almost impossible to comprehend. The acquisition taking place tonight was not the beginning. It wasn't even the second or third occurrence. It was simply the latest. Across multiple years, several mergers and acquisitions displayed the same pattern. Trusted executives approved deals based on incomplete information. Hidden liabilities surfaced later. Companies lost value. Shareholders suffered. Meanwhile, carefully positioned investors earned extraordinary returns. The operation relied on complexity. Most people never questioned what they didn't fully understand. Legal language, international negotiations, translation nuances, corporate structures. The scheme thrived inside details few people examined closely. And whenever those details needed manipulation, Mark Hartman appeared. Sometimes directly, sometimes through intermediaries. Always close enough to influence outcomes. Never close enough to attract suspicion. Until now. For Claire Parker, however, another truth was beginning to emerge. Throughout the evening, she had focused on stopping Ethan Caldwell from becoming the next victim. But as evidence accumulated, her thoughts returned repeatedly to her father. The company he built. The employees who lost jobs. The years of confusion that followed. For decades her family believed they had simply fallen victim to a disastrous business decision. Yet the names appearing in old records now told a different story. Investigators uncovered links connecting the senior executives' network to transactions stretching back years. Among those transactions was the acquisition that destroyed her father's company. The discovery left Claire speechless. She had spent years wondering what went wrong. Years wondering whether her father had missed warning signs. Years wondering whether the collapse could have been prevented. The answer was finally standing in front of her. Her father had never been careless. He had never been reckless. He had been deceived. The realization brought an emotion Claire hadn't expected. Relief. Not because the loss hurt any less. Not because the damage could be undone. But because the burden of uncertainty finally disappeared. Her father had carried responsibility for that collapse until the day he died. He blamed himself for trusting the wrong people. He questioned every decision. He replayed negotiations, endlessly searching for mistakes. Now Claire understood the truth. The outcome had been manipulated before the deal was ever completed. The people involved had never intended to play fairly. Her father hadn't lost because he was incompetent. He lost because he was targeted. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell appeared to be reaching a similar conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming. The trusted advisor's communications, the financial records, the altered documents, the repeated connections to failed acquisitions. One by one, the walls protecting the scheme collapsed. The executive who had spent years operating in the shadows could no longer hide behind complexity or procedure. His silence became more revealing than any statement. The room that had once prepared to celebrate a billion-dollar acquisition now witnessed the destruction of a years-long fraud. And for Ethan Caldwell, the most painful part wasn't discovering that someone wanted his money. It was discovering that someone he trusted had been helping them take it. As attorneys prepared to contact federal investigators and corporate compliance teams, Ethan's attention shifted toward Claire Parker, the waitress nobody noticed. The woman security had nearly removed from the room. The woman executives dismissed because she lacked a title, an office, or a seat at the negotiation table. Without Claire, the acquisition would have been signed. Without Claire, the deception would have succeeded. Without Claire, another company might have joined a growing list of victims connected to a scheme hidden in plain sight. The translator had changed only 6 words. That was how the story began. 6 words nobody noticed. 6 words that revealed a lie. And now those 6 words had exposed an entire network of betrayal stretching back years. But the final chapter of the story was still waiting to be written. The aftermath began before anyone even left the Belmore room. What should have been a celebration became an emergency investigation. The signing ceremony ended abruptly. Attorneys secured every document connected to the acquisition. Corporate compliance officers were contacted immediately. Digital records were preserved. Internal communications were frozen. Nobody wanted to be the person who overlooked another critical detail. Within days, the story exploded beyond the walls of the Manhattan restaurant. Financial journalists began asking questions. Business networks interrupted regular programming. Industry analysts tried to understand how a billion-dollar acquisition had come within minutes of disaster. The answer always led back to the same place. A translator, 6 altered words, and a waitress who refused to stay silent. As investigators followed the evidence, the scope of the fraud became impossible to ignore. Mark Hartman's communications revealed years of carefully coordinated manipulation. Multiple acquisitions were re-examined. Corporate records were subpoenaed. Financial transactions were traced through consulting firms, shell companies, and investment groups scattered across several countries. What initially appeared to be an isolated act of deception evolved into something much larger. A network, a pattern, a business model built on trust and betrayal. Arrests followed. First came several intermediaries connected to suspicious investment activities. Then consultants linked to fraudulent advisory agreements. Then individuals responsible for moving money between entities designed to hide profits. Each arrest uncovered another layer. Each layer revealed more victims. Companies, employees, shareholders, families, people whose lives had been changed by deals they never fully understood. And at the center of it all stood the senior executive who had spent years earning the confidence of people like Ethan Caldwell, the trusted advisor, the man who sat beside CEOs, the man who offered strategic guidance, the man nobody suspected. For years, he had positioned himself close to power while quietly exploiting it. Every acquisition, every merger, every negotiation, another opportunity, another target, another chance to profit while someone else paid the price. For Ethan Caldwell, the financial damage had been prevented. The acquisition survived. The company survived. The investors survived. But something else didn't. Trust. That loss proved far more difficult to measure. Money could be recovered. Contracts could be rewritten. Companies could move forward. But discovering that someone you trusted for years had secretly worked against you changes the way you see every decision that came before it. Every conversation felt different. Every recommendation carried new meaning. Every memory became a question. What was real? And what had been manipulation? Yet the biggest revelation was still waiting. Because while investigators reviewed decades of records, one discovery connected everything. One discovery transformed Claire Parker's story from coincidence into destiny. Buried inside archived corporate documents was evidence linking the senior executive directly to the acquisition that destroyed her father's manufacturing company years earlier. Not indirectly, not through distant connections. Directly, the same network, the same methods, the same strategy, the same people. The collapse that ruined Claire's family and the fraud targeting Ethan Caldwell had never been separate stories. They were chapters of the same story. The connection stretched back years. Long before Ethan Caldwell ever entered the picture. Long before Mark Hartman translated a single word inside the Belmore room. Long before Claire Parker carried a bottle of wine into that private dining room. The people responsible for one tragedy had been preparing the next. And if Claire had not recognized those 6 altered words, the cycle would have continued again, and again, and again. For years, Claire wondered why her father's company collapsed. She wondered whether he missed warning signs, whether he trusted the wrong people, whether he could have prevented what happened. Now she finally had the answer. Her father was never defeated by bad luck. He was never defeated by incompetence. He was never defeated by poor judgment. He was deceived. The truth didn't restore what had been lost. It didn't reopen the factory. It didn't bring back the years of hardship. But it gave Claire something she had searched for her entire life. Answers. And sometimes answers are the closest thing to justice. Months later, when reporters continued covering the scandal, they often focused on the same remarkable detail. The billion-dollar fraud wasn't uncovered by regulators. It wasn't uncovered by lawyers. It wasn't uncovered by executives. It was uncovered by Claire Parker, the waitress nobody noticed. The woman everyone overlooked. The only person in the room who understood what was really being said. The translator changed only 6 words. 6 words that almost changed the future of an entire company. 6 words that exposed years of deception. 6 words that connected 2 stories separated by decades. And in the end, the billion-dollar deal survived. But trust didn't. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making decisions. It's the one everyone assumes is simply translating them. And now we'd like to hear from you. If you were sitting at that table, would you have noticed the warning signs? Would you have trusted Mark Hartman? Would you have believed Claire Parker? Or would you have signed the deal just like everyone else was preparing to do? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about hidden deception, corporate secrets, shocking betrayals, and unexpected heroes, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Because the next story may be even harder to believe than this one. And sometimes, the biggest lies are hidden inside the smallest words.